Hi, welcome to my TikTok live, and just want to say that in this one, excuse me, start with the cough, just going to say in this one, I am going to be talking about stuff that happened to me growing up. So if you're worried about being triggered, you shouldn't watch this. I can't see how to put anything on there that gives the warning as people join. But yeah, so if you're listening to this is a bit of background about how I became a trauma therapist and why I became a trauma therapist. And so it's entirely possible that I will be discussing subjects that could be triggering to some, so exercise caution. I'll try and not get too graphic. And I'll try and share it afterwards. So it can be as interactive as you want it to be, by the way. So, ask questions as I talk. It might take me a little while and it might be a little bit halted as I kind of try and read the comments. Always a bit weird, these lives, aren't they? Because you're kind of like looking down and looking up and talking about stuff. But somebody commented on one of my videos, and if you've watched any of my videos, what you'll know is I always start with telling you my name, which is Dawn Walton, and that I'm a trauma therapist. And somebody commented on one of my videos saying that they thought I was saying I was traumatized, and they were like, "Oh, poor you." And the thing is that I was traumatized. So I became a trauma therapist because I know what it's like to have experienced trauma. But actually, more importantly, I know how it's possible to overcome experiencing trauma. So for me, it's really critical that it's not just about having similar experiences to different people. It's about what you do with those experiences and how they affect your life. And that's why I think I can do what I do really well, is because, yes, I'm lucky enough to have had lots of different experiences, but also I have overcome them and got to a better place, so I know what's possible. So I guess we could start with the general heads up. So I went to university when I was 18 to study computer science. I'm a geek. And I went to university with a bottle of my mother's strong painkillers. Now, my mother was disabled, and it was a time where you used to get the bottles of tablets, right? So you couldn't really tell how many were in there. It wasn't like the little bubble packets where you could tell where they've got. So she was like, these are the ones that you shouldn't touch. So for the last year of my time at home, I was collecting these because my plan was to end my life. It wasn't to kill myself as such, and it wasn't to do a cry for help. I didn't want anybody to find me, which is actually why I didn't take them at home, because my mother was disabled and at home all the time, and so was my stepfather. He wasn't disabled, but he was at home all the time. So, my idea of hell would be, getting caught, sending to the hospital and all that sort of stuff. So I planned it. I planned the best way of doing it, and first day at university, I sat in my halls of residence with this bottle of tablets on my table. And I just sat and I looked out the window at the people walking past and thought, it's great, nobody cares. And in the nicest kind of way, nobody cares. Everybody was walking past. And the weird thing is that I didn't even take the lid off the bottle. I kind of got up and I went down and I introduced myself to other girls in the flat, which is very unlike me because I'm not very sociable in that sense. And it was just a really weird thing, but I learned something really important in that moment. And what I learned was that nobody knew anything about me. Nobody knew any of the stuff that I'd been through. I could be anybody I wanted to be. So it was a revelation to me, and it was a revelation that actually provided a strategy that pretty much saved my life the rest of my life, because it took me many, many years to get help, and I had to survive through those years, and I was very successful. I completed my degree, I met my husband, I had a very high-powered job, travelling all over the world, and eventually I had my daughter and my family here. And so, the strategy of just pretending to be somebody else was actually just waving to everybody who says hello. That was a strategy. It's a really good strategy, and I think people really underplay dissociation as a really important strategy for being able to get through life. And I think if we had to be our true and vulnerable selves in every situation, I think it'd be very hard to get out the door. So it can be seen as a negative, but it's also a critical survival strategy. And here in the UK, if you get any psychological help on the NHS, one of the things they will automatically do is they have a diagnostic manual, basically, that takes a bunch of symptoms and matches it to a particular name of something that's up. And when you go and see a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, they will try and match your symptoms with something in the diagnostic manual, because the diagnostic manual tells you how to treat somebody. But we don't fit in boxes very well as people. So one of the common things that people will get diagnosed if they've had an abusive childhood is with BPD, borderline personality disorder, because of what I've just described. Because, you know, I would have been classed, I guess, as borderline schizophrenic in terms of the way I was living my life and the way people knew me versus who I really was inside. And borderline personality disorder is a psychosis-based disorder. But if you've had an abusive childhood, it's a survival strategy, not a wiring disorder. So you can get then stuck with that label for the rest of your life, which is a bit unfortunate, really, because it suggests that you can't change it, and you can. So I guess the question is, why did I end up at that place? So I had decided that if the first 18 years of my life were going to be like that, then I really didn't want to know what the next 18 years of my life were going to be like, or the ones after that. So that was my decision. So I believe the first 4 years of my life were pretty good. They were loving and nurturing, this kind of idyllic family unit almost. But I don't remember those years because I was too young. Our brains develop emotional abilities quite early on, but our ability to make sense of stuff and file it and order it tends to start happening around 6, 7, 8 years old. And so I've got probably emotional memories, but no real tangible ones. My brother is a couple of years older than me, has tangible memories. So when things changed, he fought against it in a way that I didn't. So somewhere around the age of 4, it's kind of hard to tell a story because everybody tells a different story. Somewhere around the age of 4, my mother left with they had a couple that was a friend, and the husband, she ran off with the husband to all accounts, took me and my brother with her, moved down to London, and he was an alcoholic and he was abusive, and so my father had to come and bring us back. And so I went from this idyllic life to that time in London, which was a very short time, to being brought back. Now, when he brought us back, he'd moved in with the wife of the guy my mum ran away with. My mum told me a different story, by the way. My mum was born with a form of spina bifida, so a bit of a spine missing. And it came to light when she was pregnant with me and my brother, and she ended up in hospital. And her story was that my dad kicked her out when she was in hospital. I have no idea what the right story is because my dad tells one story, she tells a totally different one. But the end result was I ended up living with my father and my stepmother. And my stepmother hated us, probably because my mum ran off with her husband, probably also because she was an alcoholic. And so we went from this loving, nurturing life to my mum disappearing on me without any idea why, to then being in a really violently abusive relationship with my stepmother, where the whole lay of the land changed. And as I say, for me, it just became, well, this is the way it is. My brother kind of was like, this shouldn't be this way, and I think he had a hard time of it. So she hit, she beat us, and verbally incredibly derogatory. And I used to think it was just a bit of hitting, but there's some memories that have come to light fairly recently that it was beating, and she just used to call me a hateful little shit that nobody'd ever love, which I hadn't remembered because all my memories had been without sound. So once I got the sound, then I realised the things it was saying, and because of the age I was, that formed my identity. So my identity my whole life has been a hateful little shit that nobody could love without, and that's just been accepted. We were an inconvenience, so we were left outside, not allowed to come in the house. She would only feed us because she had to. So we'd go to school, and at school dinners they would give us second and third and fourth helpings and all that sort of stuff. And we were covered in bruises. And my father, it was a chicken farm that we grew up on, so he was running the farm, so he wasn't really very present at all. And I think she was probably the same with him as she was with me and my brother. Then she had, Somebody's invited me to like decline going. So then she had a daughter, and it was her own child, right? So it would be different. And her daughter was kind of seemed to be loved and cared for, but she was still an alcoholic. So you can't get away from that. You can't get away from that sort of stuff. So anyway, so that was life. So from 4 years old onwards, mother disappeared. Living with a violent stepmother, starved, neglected. School was a lovely escape and a great place to be. My brother, you know, sometimes these things bring you together. Sometimes they don't. And yay, for me, it didn't. So my brother used to think of me as a hateful little sister. If we walked anywhere, he would walk some distance ahead. He would talk about how he would thump me if I didn't do what he wanted, and he'd be like, that's 100 thumps, that's 1,000 thumps, that's 10,000 thumps. And I was quite young, so I'm like, oh man, you know, I really don't want 10,000 thumps. And one day in the taxi on the way to school, he executed on it. I must have really pissed him off, and he just pasted the hell out of my arm. So I turned up at school crying, and he got in a bit of trouble for that, but you know, that's the way of things. But so I haven't got a good relationship with my brother. I think I was inconvenient to him, and he was dealing with his own stuff. My mother met a new man, and despite having a series of operations, she started getting herself together, and we started going to stay with her for little spells of time. And one day there was what I now know as a social worker was sent to the house. So apparently we were under social work observation. Shows how much that follows. And really works well, that one. And she came to the house, and my stepmother said that we had to tell her that we wanted to live there and we liked living there, and not to tell her anything that was going on. You know, it was all about keeping secrets. And my brother, when he was asked, dutifully did that. And for some reason, when I was asked, I went, no, I want to live with my mum. Now, apparently I was about 8 years old, which meant that I was legally old enough to have an opinion in that matter. And but my dad took me on the knee afterwards, and my dad never did anything to me. He was fairly passive in my life. But he took me on his knee afterwards, and he said, I'm really disappointed in you. You know, if you don't want to live with me, then I don't love you. And for me, I think in the context of everything that had gone on, that just was a normal thing. You know, it was like, all right, okay, you know, it's like a statement of fact. So be it. And then in one summer holidays, when my sister was about 9 months old, me and my brother went to stay with my mother over the summer holidays. And at the end of the summer holidays, this was in Stockport near Manchester, my mother said, hey, how would you like to stay with us and not go back? Well, that's a bit of a no-brainer, right? It's like, yeah, stay somewhere where we don't get hit and we get fed, or go back? No. So we'll stay. And again, apparently because of what I'd said to the social worker, that was possible. So we stayed. And we lived in Stockport, and for me it was like an extended summer holiday. There was food, there was no hitting, there was no fear. The school was lovely. School was always my escape. My brother started going off the rails. He started high school. I was still in primary school. And for him, because he'd been older, I think it was having an effect on him far more than me. I just adapted, right? I just like, okay, this is the way the world works now. This is the way the world works now. And then after about a year of this wonderful like little annex of sunshine, we moved back to Anglesey in North Wales. And my stepfather used to be a long distance lorry driver, and he changed jobs, and he was managing a supermarket or something. And so I think my mum had lots of friends in Stockport, and then when we moved back to Wales, she was cut off from everybody. She got really ill. She wouldn't get up till 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And my stepfather came very controlling. He was like a slave driver. We had to iron his shirts and make sure the collars were just right. We had to make his sandwiches for lunch, and they had to be just right. You had to butter to the edge. You had to have 2 things on them. If you did the dishes, you know, he would check and make sure everything was okay. So my brother started rebelling even more. Excuse me. My brother started rebelling even more, and because we've been from an experience where the consequences of not doing what you're told were pretty severe, it didn't matter that he didn't shout and he didn't hit us. It was just like you didn't object, right? And my mother was ill, so we became slaves in the house, doing all the things, but they had to be done just so. My brother and I continued to not have a good relationship. You know, he would shout at me and slam his door if I tried to, because he's my big brother. He had cool stuff in his room. And I wanted his cool stuff. But my brother, whenever he was accused of anything, would just start crying, and I wouldn't start crying because I learned not to cry when my stepmother hit me for crying. So I just stood there and I would get in all the trouble. So caution, it's triggering, right? So then the next thing, like the other stuff, wasn't triggering. Then my stepfather started visiting at night, and he said, I'm going to teach you what boys do to girls. And so he did, and he ramped that up over a couple of years. But it was never about him, it was always focused on me. So that became part of the new thing. And he would use the chores for my lack of cooperation, because I would always kind of play fight and try and get out of it, even though it never worked. So I even broke his rib one day because I kicked in the play fighting, and he couldn't really tell anybody what had happened, so it was a bit of a result. But he would use the chores. And then one day he decided that, I wasn't doing the chores well enough. So he, with my mother's agreement, he took the belt to me. He took me into my room, he pulled my pants down, and he hit me with a belt 6 times. And then afterwards, he just sat calmly next to me and told me that that's because I wasn't cooperating. Nothing to do with the chores. It was because I wasn't cooperating, and that's why I got hit. So the chores were used as huge leverage for what was going on. But that was, it was just, it was 11, 12 years old, 10, 11, 12 years old. So my brain wasn't really, I was just confused. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't understand what was going on. I knew I didn't want it to go on, but I just adapted, right? This is what I'd always done, until I went to stay with my mother's best friend, back in Stockport. And I stayed with her for a week, and, she was a younger person, and we got on really well. And the whole week she kept going, oh, you're going to really learn to like your stepfather, really? I'm like, no, I'm not. Honestly, I'm not. And on the night before I went home, I went back downstairs after I'd gone to bed, and I just had to tell them, I'm like, look, this is why I'm not going to like him. And her and her husband sat there and said, are you sure? That's a really serious accusation. And I went, yeah. And I wasn't doing it because I wanted anything to happen. I was just kind of like, I want you to shut up to say I like him, because I won't learn to like him. So I got on the train and went home, but then after that, it was like, what it's like when you've spoken out something? I told somebody, and after I told somebody, it became, the thought that he might do it again became actually quite unbearable to me. So I asked her to tell my mum, and she told my mum, and my mum went spare. My mum absolutely lost her temper with me, which my mother doesn't do. She wasn't a kind of angry person at all. And she went really mad at me, and apparently I begged and I sobbed her to get me out of there, and she said, what do you expect me to do? And I, at the time, assumed that she didn't believe me, and that she had, I knew she'd fought for custody of me and my brother and wasn't willing to let us go under any circumstance. I'm like, send me into care, I don't care, I just need out of here. But what she said is, just don't talk about this again. And so I didn't. So from about 12 years old, I have no memories. I have an absolute blank memories. Not a few memories, not like these little sparse ones or very few or anything. I have no memories. My brain just shut down. Because one of the things I've learned over the last year since she died is that she did believe me. She did know exactly what was going on. She had actually walked in at one point and just walked back out again. And I had let her secret out by telling her best friend, and so she was really pissed off with me, and that's why she was mad, because I'd let the secret out. I learnt this many years later, and I've also learnt that from that point forward, she kept me away from anybody that I could ever talk to again, including psychological help and stuff like that later. But to me, I'd spoken out, nothing was being done, nothing was going to change, and I have a kitten. Hey, kitten. Like, when you're talking really traumatic stuff, what you need is a cute kitten. So, big up kitten point. So for me, I don't know, I didn't have these memories, but I just have this blank space. And actually, I had a fellow therapist friend help me try and look into that, because actually in that blank space, some great memories with my best friend at But as we dipped into it, it became clear that the abuse continued after I told her. And it was like, okay, that's why my brain shut off on that. So we leave that, right? We don't need to go there. It's fine. It's perfectly okay. So then I guess I ended up in this sort of pretense, right? So my brother ran away from home when he was 16. He tried when he was 14. They brought him back. When he was 16, he ran away from home. And he always wanted to be a punk. He had turned his Action Man figure into a punk, which was really cool. He was very skilled, my brother, very artistic. He's still alive, by the way. And he lived on the streets of London. He's been a drug addict his whole life. At the moment, he can't leave his bed at home in his flat because he's a heroin addict and he got pancreatitis. And so he has never dealt with it because he was older, and I think it's affected him a lot more. But that's his path in life, and he didn't have all the stuff that I happened. So anyway, so I carried on living my life. I became my mother's carer. Now with my brother not there, we moved again. My stepfather ended up without a job, being a full-time carer, so he was at home all the time. When we moved, I think the abuse stopped. And I think our relationship dynamic stopped. I think he was almost scared of me. My mum would come and hide in my room if she was scared of him and stuff, which just seemed like really crazy. But I had this really close relationship with my mother because she seemed to be the only one that had loved me and cared for me. And, you know, or even when I went to university, I was just constantly buying her stuff, visiting her and all that sort of stuff. And I guess in denial, Stockholm Syndrome, I don't know what it was, but would go back and just look after her all the time. And then life carried on. So I went to university. Actually, before that, when I was about 17, I started getting really sick when I tried to go to school. Now, school's always been my great place. It's been my safe place. But what happened is at 16 years old, I was talking to my best friend at the time. And we'd gone into town and we were coming back. And she's like, do you want to come to the nightclub or something like that? And I was saying, no. And she was like, do you not like boys? And I said, I know too much about what boys do to girls, right? Remember what he said? And it was just like, everything unlocked. All these memories that I'd kind of buried just went, blah, 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 blah. And I just became really internal. I thought she wouldn't want to have anything to do with me, which she probably didn't by the time I was freaking out anyway. I started having panic attacks. I know the panic attacks now. I didn't know at the time, right? So I know now that it was anxiety and I was just sick. If I tried to go to school in the morning, I'd be sick. In the afternoon, I'd be fine. So you get all the inevitable jokes about morning sickness, right? Now, because my mother didn't want anybody to know what had gone on, I wasn't getting any help. So I did speak to a local GP who has one of the best friends of hers. So I didn't tell him anything, obviously. And then I went to hospital for physical tests. In fact, a doctor examined me and was convinced I'd had a baby because after the examination, there were signs of sexual activity and I lost a lot of weight with the anxiety. And it was like, you must have had a baby. I'm like, no, I've not had a baby, And so obviously they found nothing physical, but then it was fine when I went to university because I went to university planning on killing myself, killed off that version of me, got on with life, had a really successful life, met a guy who is just amazing. He's my soulmate. I could have met anybody and I met him. So I'm really lucky that I met him. And, as I say, I'm a geek. So I got this tech support job, moved down to Watford. Ended up with a consultancy job where I travelled all over the world and was very, very successful at what I did. And then moved up here to Scotland where I've been for 22 years, I think now. And I'd always said I didn't want kids because I didn't want to screw them up. Plus the kind of physical aspect and the intrusion of it was just horrific. But my body clock kicked in and I was like, okay, I really want kids. So I ended up seeing, for the first time, I saw a counsellor. I saw a person-centred counsellor for about 2 years. And as part of that process, I confronted my mother. I had meetings with her. She said she believed me and that she protected me. She stayed outside the room and things like that, which obviously is her story now, and we know that that's not true. And my relationship with her became really fractured at that point because it was really unbearable to have her not get the scale of what happened. She offered if we could go to therapy together. She kind of made everything about her. But I got to this point where I decided to have a child. I was able to. I kind of brain kicked in, body kicked in, whatever. My first boy was born prematurely at 26 weeks. My husband was having a quadruple heart bypass operation at the time of his 12-week scan. And I think there was a certain amount of stress He was born prematurely at 26 weeks and he died after 30 days. My husband and I agreed before he was even born that whatever happened, we would have another child. I'd always wanted 2 kids. So we had my other child. She went overdue 2 weeks. But everything was fine with her. And so it got to the stage that when she was about 3 years old, she started saying, "Are you happy, Mummy?" And I'd go, "Yes, darling, I'm happy." And she'd say, "Are you happy, Mummy?" And I go, "Yes, darling, I'm happy." And I went on Twitter and I said, what's going on here? Why does my daughter keep asking me if I'm happy? And they said, well, she's learning empathy. And I went, not very well, right? So I keep saying, but maybe she was learning it too well. And I realised, I think in that moment, that it was one thing me being screwed up, but it was not okay for that to screw her up as well. And that's where I came across, through a series of coincidences and opportunities, a guy who practiced out of Harley Street called Trevor Sylvester that does a form of therapy called cognitive hypnotherapy that he's the founder of. And, a friend had said, go, he'll be able to help you. I'm like, well, I can't afford to go to Harley Street. I mean, I had a good job, but Harley Street, it's like prime location in London for like the amount of sessions I'm going to need. And then I spoke back and forth with him on email, and I kind of got that, well, what if it's true? What if he can really help me? Wouldn't that be amazing? So I went to see him, but I took a friend, right? Because I'm not going to go see some strange guy in a room who's going to tell me to close my eyes. That's not going to happen. So I took a friend. And after the first session, it was really weird because I was sitting in London City Airport with a flight home, and there was a silence in my head. And I hadn't realised there was a noise in my head until there was a silence in my head, right? I'm like, how the hell? So I'd basically sat in a session with this guy for an hour and a half, deliberately not listening and doing anything that he asked me to do, being really awkward about it because I was triggered. I was massively triggered. But he ended up taking me back to a memory the first time my stepmother hit me. And he's like, if you could tell that 6-year-old you something that would be useful to her, what would you tell her? And I said, duck and run. That was a good strategy, right? But not really the sort of thing he was looking for. It was kind of understanding that she was an alcoholic and it wasn't about me and things like that. And in the end, I gave her a copy of Trevor's book and said, read that because I love learning. And that created this shift that I didn't think was possible, having sat and been quite resistant to everything that happened. And it was just this awareness, this silence. I'm like, blimey, how is that even possible with everything I've been through to create a shift like that? So by the second session, it just felt like everything in my life had brought me to this point. It's like, I need to learn how to do this. Now, that was May 2011 was my first session. Since then, I've had about 8 sessions. I haven't had any for a good few years now. I've kind of outgrown that way of doing it. But 8 sessions, and then by the 3rd session, I booked to do the training. And I'm like, I have to learn how to do this. And then that's where everything's developed and everything's grown. I was doing a 6-figure salary in BT here in the UK, and I left that to become a full-time therapist in 2013, and I've been doing that ever since. And I just think that I am super lucky to be able to have experienced such a significant transformation, because what it means is that anybody who sits in front of me and know I can help them, I don't always know how, and I don't always know what it's going to be, but it doesn't really matter what they've been through. And nobody's going to have been through the same experiences, and nobody's going to have taken it in the same way. Look at me and my brother, My brother has never dealt with it. He's never been able to get over the stuff that happened. I dealt with it, but in a different way. So one of the things I learned when my mum died, when I hooked up with a kind of second cousin who was around when I was a baby and helped my mum out, was just how much my mum cut me off from everybody. So this whole family, this whole branch of the family that were just being told that I was busy and having this wonderful life, and that's why I wasn't all at the family events, and my mother wasn't telling me anything about it. And what I've realised is she was protecting the story that she'd been telling. It's called, there's a few different ones. So the method is Quest Cognitive Hypnotherapy, which is done out of Regent's University in London. I think it's called Cognitive Hypnotherapy. What's that about and how can I use it? Trevor Sylvester, with an I, is his name. He's got a few books. But yeah, if you look at the Quest Institute in London, They do one training course a year. It's a massively transformational course. It is the most brilliant course that you could ever go on, even if you're not thinking of being a practicing therapist, to consider the course. Since the pandemic, they do it online, which is amazing. So one of the things that I really struggled with over the years was knowing what my stepfather did. And in later years, there was a woman who my mum was good friends with, who lived on a lane opposite ours. And she had a granddaughter, and I think her daughter had all sorts of challenges, so she was with her granddaughter a lot of the time. And he'd spend a lot of time down in that house, and I was absolutely convinced that something was going on. He also had his own daughter, and there was a really fractious relationship with her. So I had been carrying this guilt of not speaking out for most of my life, but absolutely would have hated, right before 2012, 2013, I would have been mortified if anybody knew I'd been abused. I would just not tell anybody anything like that. But thanks to all the therapy and all the changes, I was like, I'm okay talking about it. I can deal with this now. So I reported him. I reported him to the NSPCC in June 2013. And after 2 years, it went through, the CPS put it through a year later, and my mother tried to piggyback her own case with the CPS off it against him, but they wouldn't tell me what it was because of data protection and things like that. And so my mother tried to piggyback off that. Luckily, they chucked hers out and not mine. But all the way through, right from the start, I said, look, I'm reporting him. He said, I'll do anything you need to. I'll do anything I'll need to. But the police officer in charge of it was like, have you spoken to your mother? Because she's not talking to us. And then they said she's not corroborating your story. And I'm like, I don't get how I can get how she didn't believe me, but how could she not corroborate my story? So there was a series of email exchanges that we'd had when I was seeing the counsellor, where she'd gone, oh, you must think I'm the worst mother ever. Of course I believed you. Like, what we have to do is yell plot twist occasionally, right? So just while we're having a plot twist moment, my grandfather, so my father's father, is a paedophile, or was a paedophile. He's dead now. And he used to come and pick us up to go and stay with my grandmother, who was like an hour away. My granny was lovely, and we loved staying with her. But we had to travel. He was a fisherman in his fish van, and it had one of those front bench seats. And my brother used to make me sit next to him. And he would have his hand down my pants all the way on the trip there and all the way on the trip back. And at the time, I was too young. I just thought this was super uncomfortable. But my brother made me sit next to him, so I think he did it to him as well, if he got a chance. And I had told my mum this in Stockport, and my father and my grandfather actually come and tried to kidnap us back, which always confused me because I'm like, my stepmother doesn't want us. But she said, so in this email exchange, she said, oh, I believed you about him, and I reported him and all this sort of stuff. I'm like, yeah, you did. So you believe me. It was, at that point, it was still didn't believe me. So when the policewoman said she's not corroborating your story, I sent these emails because I kept the copy of these. I sent these emails. Look, she believed me. Look, she says she believes me. During the trial, it was the most horrific experience. I certainly wouldn't do it for closure. I mean, it was good because I was absolutely convinced I'd been believed, and I knew I didn't make it up because I gave 4 hours of video evidence with all the graphic detail, which I was able to do thanks to the therapy I'd had, but still was horrific. The idea was that would get played, so I wouldn't have to stand in the stand and say it. As it happens, it got played while I had to sit and watch it with the camera on me, while the judge, the jury, and him, I guess, he must have probably got off on that quite a lot, got to sit and watch me going through that video evidence, which was... So trial was horrific. There were special measures in place. I never had to see him. He never saw me in that sense. But yeah... not good. But anyway, so I'm going through all of this and I go, right, so I'll give the police officer these emails to say, she did believe me. Look, she did believe me. And in those emails, they mentioned the stuff that happened with him. So he was absolutely useless on the trial. I didn't sit through it. A friend had come down with me and sat through and reported on it. He did all but confess. There was a time where he abused me when we went to stay in Ireland. It was like I was mortified because I was sharing a room with my brother, and he just came and while I was in my sleeping bag, did stuff. And when I told the police about that, the solicitor asked him about that, or the barrister asked him about that. And he says, well, I wouldn't have done that because it would be too easy to be caught, wouldn't it? Like he just said it was just awful. But his defense lawyer said that it wasn't him, it was my grandfather. All those things I described were actually my grandfather. Now, the only person that could have said, no, it was him, was somebody who knew that it had happened. My friend, who I disclosed to, did testify, and she was a psychologist, but she couldn't say categorically that it wasn't my grandfather because she wasn't there. The only person was my mum. So they used my grandfather to get him out of it because they didn't have to say it didn't happen. They just had to say it wasn't him. And my mother's statement, she didn't turn up to court. Her statement was so bad that it was better to not read it out than to read it, and it was better to have the jury believe she didn't believe me than read out whatever she'd written in my statement. So after the trial, he was found not guilty, by the way. So after 3 days of hell, he was found not guilty and was able to walk away scot-free. All these people that I was hoping to speak out for, wasn't able to achieve anything for them. The police were devastated because everybody was convinced. The CPS were 95% sure of conviction. The criminal injuries compensation was like 100% because there was no doubt that he was guilty. But the jury had a viable alternative, and they were made up of students. Half the time they couldn't come in because they slept in late. I was told to make eye contact with them during the trial. I couldn't because they weren't looking at me. But what was brought up in the trial was how both the defence and the prosecution talked about how horrific the earlier years with my stepmother and father were, and how the school knew about us being covered in bruises and starved. And it was, for me, it was a revelation because I'd never heard it described as horrific. I just thought it was a bit of hitting. So for me, the trial was quite an experience. But yeah, he was found not guilty. And that was because my mum didn't show up. So after that, I was like, I'm not having anything to do with you. You can't have anything to do with your granddaughter. You're out of my life. And she wasn't getting the message, but she eventually got the message. And so from 2015, didn't speak to my mother again and didn't speak to her. And then she died last year in July. And what I've learned is that the story that she told all her friends and everybody during the trial was it was inappropriate play fighting and that she'd stopped it. That was her version of her narrative that she'd used to help everybody feel sorry for her. And it was just like Dawn's doing the Jimmy Savile thing and just making a big deal out of nothing. And that explains why they couldn't read a statement out, right? Because if her statement had been read out saying it was inappropriate play fighting, then what would have happened then? You know, the jury, it would have undermined all the evidence because I would have been it would sound like it happened, but I was making it up or whatever. It wasn't inappropriate play fighting, obviously. It was everything but rape. But so, are you with me still? Like some of you are hanging in there, so well done. Well done. You're still here. I got the help and I did the therapy, and now I'm over. My kitten's killing things in the background. Now I'm on a place where if I get stuck, I get help. I am very lucky to have some amazing people around me. So Trevor helped me a lot. I kind of outgrew him, and I've got other friends that have helped me. And then this second cousin that was a really important part of my childhood, and I know she was, but I can't remember it, has shared with me these memories. Like there's a photograph of me in a little pink dress when I was little. I always thought I was a hateful little shit. That's my narrative, right? I think there's something very wrong with me because I can excuse an alcoholic mother and a paedophile stepfather or whatever, but every single adult, for not a single adult to see me and kind of go, oh, what a lovely kid, I want to protect her, to see me and not see me at all, not hear me, not see me, that I didn't matter, that I was insignificant, felt for a long time, up until like a year ago, that there was something really wrong with me that would happen. And my cousin being able to go, see that picture? I took that. That look you're giving your brother is because he was really shy and you were saying, hey, Martin, don't worry. And you had this loving family, and I was devastated when they split because I didn't understand it because she was 15 at the time. And that gave me this perspective that it was just like lots of really shit stuff. And what I've realised is funnily enough, I have severe attachment issues, which I've learnt over the last year. I really zero self-worth, which I've learned over the last year. I thought I was okay. But actually what happened was, in order to kind of get through it, that child version of me has been squashed and buried and not heard and not listened to. So what I've been doing over the last year is I've been working with my cousin, who actually luckily is a qualified counsellor and is just an amazing person and really hears me. And I've been going back and dealing with the trauma and actually accepting it, acknowledging it, seeing it, working through it, helping the child version of me deal with it. And I've got more work to do. I got to tell you, I've got more work to do. But the first 7 or 8 months of the year, I just was not functioning at all, funnily enough, because I was just dealing with traumatic memories and working through stuff. And it's a lot to work through, as you can imagine. But, you know, it's like this is why I'm doing this. It doesn't really matter what I went through. None of that really matters, because there's lots of things that lots of people go through, and something that's traumatic can seem trivial to somebody else, but it can be huge in the context of your life. It's about, you know, so for me, some of these things, they could have devastated some people's lives, but they were cumulative and there were different elements of it. And my coping strategy was really good, right? I mean, I've been very successful. I've got an amazing group of friends. I've got a loving family. My husband's been with me since we met when I was 19. My child is phenomenal. And, you know, I get to do this. I get to help other people. And so it's not what happens, it's what you do with what happens that counts. And not everybody can do something. Not everybody can talk. I'm lucky I can talk. I can do this. And so for me, I get to use this to help others. And that for me, thank you. That for me is what's really important. That makes it all worthwhile, because it's, you know, I guess we all have to find meaning. We all have to find purpose. And for me, this kind of idea that none of us are broken, that none of us are beyond repair, that none of us can't be helped is my belief, because so many of us are taught that this messes you up for life. And, you know, whether it's the individual things that happened, or whether it's the fact that my brother, you know, he's 52, I think, something like that. No, 51. Yeah, 51. I turned 50 this year. I catch up with him in October, and then he has his birthday in January, and he goes ahead a year. You know, he never escaped. He never escaped that, and I did. You know, I don't get triggered anymore. I did get triggered when I was working through it all over the last year, you know, but I know how to deal with stuff. But I don't get triggered. I don't have problems in my relationships yet. I have some core issues around attachment and self-esteem. But I got people around me, and I work through that stuff. And that's it. I don't accept the status quo. I wish I could, by the way. I really wish that sometimes I could just sit and go, oh, it's fine now, right? But it isn't. You know, you'll see my series hopefully on weight. The weight, you know, physically, there is no reason for me to be the size I am, but my brain isn't okay to let go of that yet. And I say yeah, because it will do. Damn thing hasn't changed in all these years, but it will. And that's, so for me, it's curiosity is what you do. It's like, okay, what's that doing? How's it affecting? How can I change it? And use the people who are there to help you. I mean, if I had one bit of advice, don't be worried about using people to help you. If they say they will, let them. Because without these people in my life, without taking the risk, and each time it's been a huge risk for me. I'm walking into burning buildings after burning buildings, you know, and it's you know, if you watch my the thing on body and health concerns and all this sort of stuff, if you just watch my videos, you'll see how much the brain has to do. The mind and body are as one, right? You kind of think of it like a really cool car. Without a driver, a really cool car is really useless, but with a really rubbish driver, it doesn't matter how cool the car is, right? It's a partnership. The mind and body are a partnership. We forget that too often. So use the nuggets, use the sound bites, find the person who can help you. Don't accept the status quo. It might not be okay for you to do it now. You might not be in a position. That happens sometimes. I spent lots of time lying on the sofa. I still did things. I got up each day, cooked family meals and all that sort of stuff. But that's my way of dealing with it, has been to ignore what went on in my head. That's what I learned when I was 18. That's why I was really lucky at that age, because I learned not to listen to my head. That's a huge advantage in life, to not have to listen to that narrative that's going on in your head. I could stand in front of hundreds of people and talk to them. It doesn't bother me at all. I've written 4 books. I've written 5, but one was on call centre, so I don't think you'd be very interested in that. I've written 4 books. I just sit down and I write them, and I don't worry about them. I produce the content because I don't worry. It's like, really, your head gets in your way, and that's okay too, because when you're dealing with a lot of stuff, it's going to sometimes, but it doesn't have to be that way for the rest of your life. It is changeable. Everything's changeable. Sometimes it's really hard and really scary, but it can change, and the other side is amazing. Some of the stuff that happens on the other side when you've cleared this stuff, it's really cool. You get to have fun. Trevor used to say, have fun being you. Like, are you off your trolley? Why would I ever have fun being me? And I think probably there's moments that I can see what he means now. I'm not there yet, though, right? So my choice, by the way, is to share what happens because I can. I'm lucky. I can share what happens. I can do something about it. My personal friends who are in my personal circle get to see when I fall down holes, and they get to see when I climb out of them. I don't believe in just sharing the happy endings. I believe in sharing because it helps you to understand what you're going through and why you're going through it. And that there is always another side. But it can be a bit scary, right? Because sometimes you expect your therapist to be all together and sorted. Well, guess what? If I was your therapist, you're going to have to get used to the fact that I'm not. But that means I get it. I don't have these assumptions about everybody's going to be happy, skippy, clappy, fluffy bunnies and unicorns. That's not the way it works. But we can work around stuff. And there's always an answer. So even if you're not ready for it yet, know it's always possible. My book, We're All Screwed Up and That's Okay, has a lot of stuff about how this kind of thing affects you. What I did in that book is I used lots of personal examples. Maybe too many, because then there's no client confidentiality breach, right? To try and explain how this affects you and how you deal with it. My very first book, The Caveman Rules of Survival, that's with a publisher. That's just how our brain works on the primitive programming, so that the two kind of overlap, but can go together. They're on paperback, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. God, it's hard reading an audiobook. Just in case you kind of want to know more. I also have a couple of other books. I work with a lot of kids, and the Diary of a Teenage Mind Reader and Diary of a Teenage Time Traveller are fiction self-help books. So therefore, they follow a 15-year-old girl through the trials and tribulations, eating disorders, boyfriends, family issues, and all that sort of stuff. So they're quite fun, but they've got some important lessons. Oh, yay. Thank you for having my book. So my book's a good place to start if you kind of want to know more. And that's the message, right? We've all got stuff. Everybody's got stuff that happens. The last thing I want anybody to go is, oh, my stuff's not as bad as your stuff. It's irrelevant. What I've been through is irrelevant. What's relevant is that I can overcome it and the difference afterwards. And that's what I want people to know, is no matter what's happened, there is an other side and you can get over it. It doesn't really matter. There is no scale of this was worse than that or whatever. Everything's bad to you because it's in your context and your experience and how you make sense of it. So trauma is a whole big spectrum. I hear people talk about big T and little t trauma. There is no big T and little t trauma. Your brain takes whatever happens in the same way. It's the same way. So something like being dumped by your first boyfriend can be traumatic if it happens in a certain way and if you struggle to make sense of it. Just the same as some of the things that I went through. And the things that made them traumatic and not the things that you probably are thinking as you hear this. The things that stick in my mind as the trauma of them will seem relatively trivial on the scale of what happened. So hopefully you can get that. Sometimes it kind of helps. As I said at the start, when somebody said that they keep on hearing that I'm traumatized instead of I'm a trauma therapist at the start of my videos, it was like, well, actually, got plenty, but it's really lucky, right? So I've got all the examples and I know, so I always know. And so that's what I want all of you to realize is that is always possible. You can always overcome it. So recognize that sometimes you might not find the right person to help you, and that's okay. Don't give up on yourself. So, with that in mind, as I've been look how long I've been talking. Jeez. And look how long you've been listening. Oh, thank you, guys. Has anybody got any questions while I look awkwardly at the bottom where all the thingies come? TikTok does really weird lives, right? So it doesn't automatically post your lives. You can download them afterwards and share them on different platforms, but it doesn't. I need to think about whether it's worth me sharing this on TikTok or whether I even can because of the length of it. But yeah, anybody got any questions before I scoot off and leave you? Hopefully that wasn't too triggering for any of you, and you can see that there's hope and there's purpose. And thank you for your comments and your interactions and your questions while I was talking. I appreciate it. And thank you for watching my videos. I appreciate that too. Hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to you all again soon. Okay, well, I'll download it afterwards and see if it'll let me. All right. Thanks for listening in. I'll speak to you all again soon. And sorry for the people who just wanted to join. You missed it. It was really good, honestly. Bye all.